Good afternoon. My name is Melissa Borja, and I am one of the coordinators this year of the Religion and series sponsored by the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture. Welcome to the third season of the Center's Religion and series. The goal of this series is to create a space for thoughtful and engaged conversation at the intersection of religion and American studies. In these times, we need safe harbors to engage and unpack questions about the relationship between cultural transformation in North America and the category of religion. For the last 33 years, the Center, its journal, and the Young Scholar Program has been exactly that. And it's brought together scholars and practitioners to think deeply about religion and its relationship to the most important questions in our fields, on our campuses, and throughout our society. The Religion and series was created with the same goal in mind: to facilitate conversations among leading academics and thinkers who are making critically important conversations and interventions. Every third Thursday at 3 p.m. Eastern, we discuss a topic that looks at the relationship between religion, the pressing issues of our day, and their impact on the fields we study. Today, we will discuss the theme of religion and horror. Now, it's October, the time of year when Americans celebrate Halloween and indulge their fascination with all things haunted, hideous, and horrifying. And religion is a common theme in the monster movies and spirit possession thrillers that are so popular this time of year. Whether we're reading novels by Stephen King, revisiting classic films like The Exorcist, or watching new television shows like Midnight Mass, religion is everywhere in the horror genre. Religion is the source of inspiration for many of the characters, plots, and imagery that make horror so compelling. And at the same time, many Americans learn about religious people, ideas, and practices through horror. So we're so glad you're here to join us in the thought-provoking discussion with an interdisciplinary panel of experts to explore the enduring power of religion and horror in American popular culture. Because our event today is focused on conversation, we want to hear your questions, so please share them. Please submit your questions through the Q&A feature rather than the chat, so I can keep an eye on them. And in the second half of the conversation today, we'll make sure to answer your questions. Now, with no further ado, let me introduce our esteemed panel for today's discussion in alphabetical order. Our first panelist is Doug Cowan, Professor of Religious Studies and Social Development Studies at the University of Waterloo. He's the author of several books on religion and popular culture, including The Forbidden Body, Sex, Horror, and the Religious Imagination, published by NYU Press this past May. Congratulations on that new book. And also Sacred Terror, Religion and Horror on the Silver Screen, published by Baylor University Press in 2016. Erica Engstrom is director of the University of Kentucky School of Journalism and Media. An expert on mass media, gender, and religion, she, along with Joseph Valenzuela, is the author of many books, including Television, Religion, and Supernatural, Hunting Monsters, Finding Gods, published by Lexington Books in 2014, and Religion Across Television Genres, published by Peter Lang in 2018. And our third panelist today is Scott Poole, Professor of History at the College of Charleston. An expert on American politics and popular culture, he's best known as the author of Monsters in America, Our Historical Obsession with the Hideous and the Haunting, published by Baylor University Press in 2011 with the second edition in 2018. His latest book is Dark Carnivals, Modern Horror and the Origins of American Empire, from Counterpoint Press, which just came out in the last 2 weeks. So congratulations to you too. This is really exciting. So let's get the conversation started. Let's begin with a big open question. How does religion influence the horror genre? And here I invite the panelists to think about this question in relation to the different media you study: film, television, novels. and maybe give specific examples from your research of how religious themes, characters, plots, and imagery have shaped horror. So Doug, why don't you get us started here?
Okay. Well, thanks and welcome everybody, and welcome everybody who's participating that I can't see. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially to be here with Erica and with Scott. In terms of the first question, for me, they connect because at their most basic level, it seems to me that horror and religion are intimately bound up with exactly the same kind of questions. If many of us who are religious studies scholars believe that religion finds its ultimate origin in the contemplation of death, and what happens when we die, and what are the stories we tell about that, and the rituals we make about that. And horror is concerned with exactly those kinds of things, like especially when we die, when we die badly and maybe don't remain dead. We don't get to go on to whatever. And in terms of, specific, I'll give you one specific example of the way these interact is the 1931 film King Kong. Because most people think of, the Empire State Building and biplanes and, and Fay Ray. And, but what they miss is this really important scene at the very beginning where they first show up on the island and the whole thing is imbued with it's about human sacrifice. And human sacrifice places the body in ritual position in a way that no other sort of act does, and it's religion's dirty little secret. So that's the way I start off by seeing it, is they ask the same questions.
Fascinating. What do you think, Erica?
Well, according to Doug Cowan and his books on religion and horror, it comes down to fear, right? What do we fear? We fear death. We fear the unknown. What's in the dark? What is out there that we don't see? Humans don't like uncertainty. So it's religion's about fear, right? Fear of being bad, fear of what happens if you're bad, fear of what happens when you die. And then horror is also about fear. As Scott Poole talks about monsters representing certain things, right, Scott? The threats. So it's a way to cope, I think, and then it's a way to religion is a way to cope with the supernatural by using the supernatural, if you really think about it in meta terms. So I think it does come back to fear. How do we fight the scary thing? Well, we fight it with certain things that we recognize from a religion. And when we go back, of course, a lot of religion has the scary stories already in it, right? Hell, the devil, etc. The Bible, I mean, that's horror in there, all the horrible things that can happen to humans. And then how do you fight it? Through this religion and the religious tenets of these faiths and ways to combat those fears.
I'm always going to be thinking about the Bible now as a work of horror. Thank you for helping me think about that in a new way. Scott, what about you?
Well, I'm tempted just to say that Doug and Erica are absolutely right. I would add, just kind of building on their comments, thinking about what they both said about religion, horror, and the contemplation of death. I think that in the last 100 years, in particular, religion, horror has really been a way to interrogate violence and to talk about violence to the body. This is, of course, a concern of religion as well. And so I do think that it is about death. I think that the only way I would take it a bit further is that both in different ways deal with violent death. This came together for me, I think, in an interesting way in some of the discussions around the 2004 film, Passion of the Christ. There was a discussion of, should this be read as a slasher film because of the amount of gore, the amount of blood spilled, the fascination with violence being done to the body. I don't think so much just in terms of ticking off the tropes of what the slasher film means. But I would say that, we have there an example of the dark supernatural as a way to think about the traumatic nature of violence. So this is where I see them coming together.
These are such really interesting themes, the themes of violence, the theme of fear, the theme of meaning. So I think some of you have already touched on this question already, but let's dig a little bit deeper. We know that religion and horror share a lot of the same concerns and same themes. Why is there so much religion and horror? What work does that do? Let's start with you, Scott.
Well, in a way, I would reverse it a little bit, because I think this answers the question. This goes back to Erica's point. There's an awful lot of horror in religion. And I don't really mean that just as sort of a universal phenomena, or even looking back to the long history of the Inquisitions, Crusades, wars of religion, etc. In the 20th century into the 21st century, we've seen the growth of fundamentalisms in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, in Hinduism with the BJP party. In these examples, this is sort of religion at war with modernity, often in a very violent way. And so I think that it is, I think that horror is sort of endemic to religion. This idea of the Bible as a kind of work of horror that Erica alluded to, I think that that's an important point. I'm going to take a moment and advertise the work of Brandon Graffius on this, who is a biblical scholar who looks at the Bible as essentially a work of horror. So I think that it's endemic to elements of the nature of modern religion itself to think in horrific terms.
Doug or Erica, anything to add on how or why there is so much religion in horror?
I think it does stem back to the use of dark evangelicalism. This will, the devil will get you, hellfire will get you. And it's a way to tell these moral stories, right? If you're bad, this could happen to you. You could be dragged to hell. If you open the box, something will happen to you that's bad. You were told not to do it, and now you're going to be punished. But I think a lot of it, again, is that moral storytelling. Look what happened to Lot's wife. She disobeyed, and she turned into this pillar of salt. Don't let that happen to you. Don't be bad, or else hellfire will rain down from the sky and burn your city. So I think it is a lot about this. Maybe it's like a way to show transgression is punished, right? And so I think a lot of religion is in horror because it's familiar to us. I study Catholic horror, and it's familiar to me. People learn about Catholicism. Hey, there's a ghost. Oh, your house is possessed. Get a priest, right? That's, your go-to, not, well, let's check it out for, some kind of physical explanation. But in the horror films, it's, now I'm watching horror films. I see, oh, you got a ghost, you better get a priest. And that's my go-to now, not the logical how to, fix a problem. Although there are a lot of shows now that debunk, right, the ghosts. These are really good questions, Melissa, because I don't think we have definitive answers, but what we think, and then what we can see from the texts of the horror films and TV shows that we look at. I didn't really answer it, but this is just like my idea that it's already imbued in religion itself. Those of us who grew up Catholic, you see this, statues everywhere with blood coming out of them, right? The crucifix, this pretty, scary stuff that's surrounded by in a Catholic church. So I think it's just already implicit in, especially Catholicism.
One thing I think we can think of, just to build on that and to expand it a little bit, one of the things that I've tried to do is to take sort of William James's idea of religion as some sort of concern with an unseen order, without trying to make any kind of recommendation or reference to what that actually is. So you see, that allow. My dog is barking at something, but there's something that's sorry, I'm just being distracted a little bit. Anyway, if you take a movie like the 2015 movie The Witch, which Brandon wrote a whole book on, you know, it's pretty easy to read that as evil witch seduces poor unsuspecting Puritan folk who have moved to literally the edge of the deep dark forest, right? Literally and metaphorically, they're the edge. Except if you watch it through a slightly different eye, what you see at the end of that film as Anya Taylor-Joy walks into the forest, kind of sheds her clothing, and which is her it's that Puritan armor that she wore. She sheds her clothing, and as she walks through falling Black Phillip the goat, and she goes to the fire, which is like straight out of Goya. It's straight out of a Goya painting, that last scene. What we're actually watching is less this sort of temptation and you know, sort of I can't think of the right word now, but what we're seeing is actually the shifting of one worldview for another. It's not I have been taken and made a witch because witches are bad. It's she has given up one set of assumptions about what the world means. And the symbolism of shedding her clothing as she walks into the woods is the symbolism of her exchanging one worldview for another. And I think that's one of the things that horror, especially when you look at somebody like H.P. Lovecraft, with all the, you know, we all know that there are problems with HP. We get it. But when you think of like a book like, I don't know, Stephen King's Revival, what is that? It's got 2015, something like that. Revival.
Yeah, it's somewhat recent. Yeah, his kind of most Lovecraftian work in many respects. Yeah, kind of a tribute.
Exactly. If Salem's Lot is his reading of Dracula,
yeah.
Revival is his reading of Frankenstein through the lens of the cosmic indifference that the universe just doesn't give a shit about you.
Yeah.
Right. Especially in that last few chapters.
Yeah, it's the bleakest ending of a Stephen King. Not, you know, often he has like some kind of defeat of the monster in some way, but they're the monster is the cosmos itself, right? And so nobody can beat the hand of the cosmos. So yeah.
So one of I like that idea of kind of opening up the concept of what we actually even mean by religion, which is why I use the religious imagination as a concept rather than religion.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a couple of you have already gestured towards this idea already that that because religion itself and the religious imagination is so horrifying, has so much horror in it, that is maybe shaping how people engage in horror and maybe why people find it so appealing. So I'm curious, how do you think religion contributes to the popularity of horror? And to what degree is horror appealing to people because it has all of these religious elements, things that are familiar to a lot of people? What do you think, Erica?
Well, again, it's familiar. So if you were brought up a certain way, you can identify with what's going on. But there are some horror/religious texts that people from one religion would argue is not about religion, even though it's about horror. For example, the series Supernatural, which I study, had a lot of different religions. Okay, but the main defeater of evil and the go-to and the top of the chain is Catholicism, basically, because these brothers use holy water. They use Latin incantations. Priests are overall shown sympathetically. Even though you say this is religious, some people say it's not showing Christianity at all, but it's not the actual religion and the religious tenets, right, Doug? It's that religious imagination. rather than the actual practicing of a religion. Would you agree with that? It's
Well,
not like, yeah.
Sort of yes and no. One of the things that I sort of try to avoid is getting into debates about what is a real representation of, what is an authentic representation of a particular faith, because, among other things, there's artistic license involved, and B, who gets to decide what's the authentic, who gets to decide what's authentic Catholicism, given that, who's the Catholic priest? He's about 135 years old now. He's in Rome, and he's the one who runs the exorcism school. His name escapes me, but I mean, you get these kind of things happening, and then you get a whole bunch of other Catholics going, no, that's not us. We don't live in the Middle Ages anymore. So I try not to get into debates and actually ask they're good questions, but I try to ask different ones, like, okay, if you don't know anything about Catholicism, you were raised Catholic. Gabriel Amorth, there we go, somebody put it in there. If you don't know anything about Catholicism, right, and you go to see The Exorcist, and I show it in class, even though that Tubular Bells theme, my hair still goes back up on the back of my neck, because I saw it the first time in this creepy old theater when I was 15. If you don't know anything about Catholicism, that becomes everything you do know. So that when somebody mentions Catholic priest, something happened to the Catholic Church, the availability heuristic just kind of shoves that right into the front of your mind. So this is what we were talking about earlier, is how pop culture is this extraordinary vehicle for shaping understanding, far more so than churches and mosques and synagogues and temples, it seems to me. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Again, if you're not a theologian, right, and you don't study it and go to seminary school or theological, classes, then you would say, yeah, that's what Catholics are, right? They're priests and they have holy water, and women can't do it, right? If you're a woman, you can't use holy water; it won't work, apparently. But yeah, everything Doug said, I think, is correct. Well, he's the expert on it, but you could have a whole seminar on just The Exorcist as perhaps the pinnacle of this idea of religion and horror, in that it is probably the scariest movie I've ever, it terrifies me to this day, and people, make fun of it and stuff, but it's pretty still scary.
It holds up well, but students always ask me, what's your favorite horror movie? And hands down, it's Ridley Scott's Master Class. Alien. It's not religious at all, but it's a dark room after dark room after dark room escapade.
I really thought you were going to say Hellraiser.
Yeah, that's the one that got me started on the whole thing.
Okay. Yeah. I'm really interested in the discussion about authenticity and the way in which pop culture and religion actually often work together and have a mutually beneficial relationship. I think that, one thing I would add is that all of us, of course, who study mass culture in one way or another, try to keep it at the front of our minds that we're studying commodities. We're studying things that are to be sold. And of course, there's a commodity aspect to the religious experience as well. There's a material side to that. There's things to buy and experiences to sort of purchase your way into. And I think this plays a really interesting role in film. It played an interesting role in a film like The Exorcist, where you have popular culture really feeding very directly off a particular vision of Catholic experience, and indeed having, to use the word, the imprimatur of the church in the form of the Jesuits of Georgetown, acting as technical advisors and as actors in the film. And, at the same time, from the opposite end of things, you had people of faith, of all kinds of faiths, who saw The Exorcist, who took away from it much more than they had ever taken from their catechism classes or their Bibles about what the devil is, what possession looks like, how exorcism works. And of course, just in terms of religious change, this is right at the heart, not only of the sort of big comeback, post-Vatican II comeback of exorcism in the Catholic Church. It's also the explosion of American Pentecostalism, or as it began to call itself, the charismatic movement in those years. More recently, we've seen that same phenomena with The Conjuring. The original Conjuring, there was this real effort on the part of the producers and the writers to actively build a relationship with evangelical churches in particular, to go on the Christian Broadcasting Network, to hold screenings for youth pastors and others, and just and to try to build a similar, and I think it was actually pretty successful in building the same kind of what the entrepreneurs call synergy between their film and people of faith. So I think the commodification of religion kind of goes along with just understanding that we're talking about pop culture commodities as well, and that these things work together.
Yeah, the same thing was done for the Passion of the Christ.
Absolutely.
Whole busloads where people were taken to
and
to see it.
I'm glad you said that, because I think in many ways the sort of campaign, and it was a quite well organized campaign with The Conjuring, it was sort of built on what had been done with Passion as kind of like the archetype of that.
Yeah,
so,
if I remember, I'm trying to remember Brent Plate's kind of argument about this, is that the whole thing came from Icon Productions, which is Mel Gibson's production company.
Right.
And because they were worried that they were going to lose the $50 million that they'd spent on this. So they needed to figure out a way to bring it back. So it's a great point.
Yeah. Well, and then, The Conjuring, at least some of the producers on The Conjuring had worked on the very controversial Bible series that the History Channel did around 2012. So that was that was sort of where the money was coming from for that film, that a lot of people feel told them a lot about the nature of faith and the nature of evil.
So we have some really great questions in the chat, and I'm going to first remind everyone, put your questions in the chat, or the Q&A function, I should say that, if you haven't done so already. I'm going to ask one more question that I generated beforehand, but then I'll turn it over to audience questions. So here at the University of Michigan, where I teach, we have a festival going on right now called Halloween. It's a Muslim horror festival. A lot of our conversation so far has focused on representations of Christianity, especially Catholicism. But the fact that Halloween is going on reminds me, we should think comparatively. We should think about how different religions are represented or engage in horror, and vice versa. We might think about this beyond the US and think globally. So I'm going to put the link to Halloween in the chat, because you can stream the Indonesian horror film tonight for free. Satan's Slaves should be really, really interesting. It streams for free for a week. But while I do that, I'd love to hear from you all. How do we see religion and horror intersect in other cultural contexts? How do we see it play out in other countries, engaging in other religions? Let's get started with you, Erica.
Well, it depends on what culture is making the text, the TV show or the film, because these other religions, right, become othered based on where you are placing the production itself. For example, studying supernatural over several years, lots of different religions, Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Muslim characters are in there. And the two brothers, for those of you who are familiar with the show, defeat basically these other religions. And the big ones that they can't defeat comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition. God they can't defeat really, but and demons from hell. But overall, they defeat all these other religion characters from other religions. So based on where you're making that text, right? The other, right, becomes defeated through the use of certain religious objects. And what's really interesting is like these exorcism films, right, that use the Catholic rituals to defeat demons that were pre-Christianity, right? Like the, right, what's your name, demon? I'm whatever from, yeah. Or, from, 10,000 years ago, and they're defeated by a Catholic priest. So it kind of shows your own perspective, the culture that in which that production is being made, being the hierarchy or the one to defeat it. Don't you find it interesting that they're able to defeat the demons that don't even have anything to do with Christianity, correct? Am I right? Yeah, the Zuzu
it's why Tunisia banned The Exorcist in 1973 as Christian propaganda.
Yes. Yeah. This is the one to defeat evil. We were talking earlier in the green room about how other cultures view horror. Japanese culture, you can't really defeat the supernatural. There's always the ambiguity at the end, right? So Stephen King might have, we defeated the evil, but in Japanese culture, the evil might, or whatever is out there, the supernatural or nature, defeats you, right? So humans are lower than those spirits from, from the Ring, or what was it, The Grudge?
Sure.
Yeah,
Ju-on.
yeah, Ju-on. So in other cultures, human beings are, powerless basically, and you just have to live with it. Would I be correct in some of the other ways that religion and philosophy place human beings, where in the West, right, humans conquer nature and are able to overcome those threats from nature? I like to hear what Scott.
Yeah, and speaking of conquest, there is, I think, an interesting phenomena in world cinema of dealing with horror in religious terms, but at times using horror to think through historical and political experiences that in many ways have been created by Western imperialism, or at least are the ugly, angry children of Western imperialism. I think particularly about the ways in which Iran has produced several very interesting horror films. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night, Under the Shadow. These films deal, respectively with the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution, the Iran-Iraq war. These are, I think, are taking the kind of the underside of the religious experience, jinn, vampires, etc., pondering the relationship that has to the kind of world that people find themselves living in, that has been sort of constructed for them by the last couple hundred years of European imperialism.
One of the things that I'd like to, when I think about, I wish I was a polyglot, but I'm not, because when you watch, say, Chinese horror films, Hong Kong horror films from the 1970s, they have a very similar look and feel to exorcism films that were produced in the same, except they're using different symbology. And they are, in this film, Ricky Lau's film series, Mr. Vampire, the idea is that there's this competition between Buddhist and Taoist priests who don't like each other because they're competing religious traditions, trying to defeat zombies, which are people who have not gone through the proper burial rituals according to the rites of their particular faith. And how do we get the Kyonsi, the hopping ghosts, to go back into their proper place in the cemetery? And in the one that I'm thinking of is they do it through this little mirror that has the 8 trigrams of the I Ching around it. And it functions in exactly the same way as the kind of technology of salvation functions in vampire movie, in sort of Western vampire movies. The other thing Erica and I were talking about this earlier. When we can compare, when we have the opportunity to compare what for me would be a foreign version of a story and exactly the same story made for an American audience, that's a rare opportunity. And Ju-on and The Grudge give us that excellent opportunity because the same director, because Ju-on failed spectacularly in the States because nobody understood it. This was told because in Japan, shit just happens to you and you can't get away from it. Whereas in The Grudge, it was done, okay, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Everything we don't understand is going to get explained to us. And I use it as an example when I'm teaching Intro to Religious Studies to say, okay, this is also how we know that Luke was not writing to Jews, because he was explaining things that no Jew would need explained. So I love that kind of comparative aspect, and which is why I'm constantly pushing my own kind of orbital folk away from, like, don't just concentrate on blockbusters. B, don't just concentrate on films that you find on Netflix because it's what they were able to afford. Like, go seek other stuff like Indonesian horror. Like, I'm so glad you brought up Iranian horror, Scott, because that movie scared the crap out of me, man.
Yeah, they're both actually really very terrifying films. Yeah.
So we had some great questions in the Q&A. I will do my best to try to ask questions that reflect a lot of different themes raised by our audience members. We had a few audience members who raised questions related to race. So Melinda asks, how should we reckon with the overt whiteness of a lot of the material? Does it tell us anything about the racial politics of American Christianity? And Professor Shirley says, can you comment on the current renaissance of Black horror films, literature, and comic graphica in relation to Black religions and religiosity? It seems to me that Africana and African American religions offer something a little different in terms of how they conceive of horror in relation to dominant white racial narratives and discourses. So who would like to begin here? We have already kind of talked a little bit about cultural difference and other religious contexts, but let's return to the US and think about racial politics domestically.
Well, I'll start with that because I have thought a good bit about the kind of the interesting trajectory of this renaissance in Black horror. I think that many people became aware of that largely through the work of Jordan Peele, Little Marvin, others, but it really is a trajectory that reaches back to the 1990s and films that at the time were not viewed as particularly mainstream. Tales from the Hood, Bones, the work of Ernest Dickerson, who and many of these same directors, Rusty Cundieff, many of them were also, involved in the larger Black film renaissance of that era, Menace to Society and et cetera. So, one of the things that I would note is that films like that have been around for some time. They have almost always critiqued white domination of American society and white supremacy. Tales from the Hood deals very explicitly with police brutality in ways that make sense for what we know about the 1990s, but also resonates in the era of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I would just note that there's there's sort of a pre-Jordan Peele world there that I think was kind of been hidden for some time.
Doug or Erica, thoughts on the racial politics of religion and horror?
I'm going to defer to my American colleagues on this, especially Scott, who has forgotten more about it than I know.
I think Scott has really studied it in depth. As you know, we're familiar. Well, I think the current Jordan Peele era is worthy of a lot more analysis. Us, that's a horror film, right? Which I read as the political and racial, but also when was it made? During the Trump era, where, you know, literally people underground came up, and, you know, the terror of that. To me, it's a political analogy. Would you agree, Scott, that that film Us is political?
I mean, it definitely,
racial.
It definitely is. I mean, I think that you know, I might read the experience of the tethered, you know, a bit differently. I mean, it seems to me to be Jordan Peele's film about class, social class as much as race, but also given the experience where the focus is, it's about the ways that race and class have always intertwined. That we talk about them in similar ways and using similar kinds of language.
This is a nice segue to another theme that an audience member brought up, which is the relationship to politics. How do we find religion and horror intersecting with politics in any context? We're not going to be a American exclusivist here. So our Canadian friend on the panel.
and just so nobody misunderstands me when I defer to my friends, that this is not to say there is not also profound racism in Canada. Let me just put that out there so that nobody thinks I'm you know, not aware of that. Can I just weigh in on the politics a bit? I think one of the things that I've sort of tried to encourage folks to do is to think past looking at films, especially because that's what we tend to focus on, as riddles to be solved rather than enigmas to be explored. And they're often used as synonyms, but I don't use them that way. Often when you look at, like, let's take the 1950s alien invasion kind of movies, treating those as a riddle is like saying, okay, all this is just a metaphor on film for a Soviet invasion. You know, problem solved. In the same way, like if you read a lot of the criticism, film criticism around The Exorcist, that especially appeared in the few years right after it, people like Beni Beit Halami treat it as a metaphor for something else. So, you know, the demonic is a metaphor for a sexual awakening of this young girl for which she's simply not prepared. And by the way, neither is anybody else. And you know what? You paid your money, you bought your ticket, you get to interpret it any way you want. But my position is that if that's all we do, it means we're going to stop asking questions about it. It's the reason I've stopped looking for Jesus figures in film. Right? It's because it's like, oh, great, there's a Jesus figure, we can stop looking. Whereas if we treat these things as enigmas, we can then ask multi-layered questions so that it is about politics, absolutely, but it can also be about all these other things at the same time. And a lot of I'm sure Scott and Erica are aware, you know, a lot of the sort of film and religion criticism relies on this kind of superficial matching model, that if we can figure out what we're talking about, then we've kind of solved the problem of the film. And, you know, I just think that's I think there are way more valuable ways to look at these profoundly important products, because they are products. I mean, religion's a product too. So, you know, yes, politics, but not only politics, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And it also can be criticism of religion. Absolutely. In religious horror.
Oh yeah.
There's a show now that I'm looking at called Evil on Paramount Plus.
Sorry.
And yeah,
Have you got to the third season yet?
Yes, I've watched all of it. And there's a lot of criticism of religion in there, social, justice criticism, gender criticism, all kinds of things wrong with the religion that is at the center of this show. So religious horror can also criticize religion as well as, quote, tell us something about a religion or use religion as a weapon against evil or the unknown. And so there are, lots of religious texts that, show religion in horror, and then, be very critical of you should be a-religious, not religious, because religion can be horror as well.
Well, religion isn't nice.
No.
As Jonathan Z. Smith so trenchantly pointed out, it's responsible for more death and suffering than any other human phenomenon in the history of our species. And not because they got it wrong, but because Moloch needed babies, right? Human sacrifice. We have this weird idea that religion must be a nice, good, decent thing, and if it isn't, it must be being done wrongly, right? Or it must be false religion, or it must be somebody else's religion, right? But there's simply no historical warrant for that or sociological warrant for that whatsoever.
Yeah. This is what you call I think you called it, is it the good, decent, and moral fallacy?
The good, moral, and decent fallacy, yeah.
Okay.
And horror is what allows us to open that up for exploration.
Scott, do you have any thoughts on the relationship between religion, horror, and politics?
Well, really quickly, I mean, in a way, I don't want to get started on that because that's sort of my whole work, but I do actually, I have a lot of agreement with Doug, especially about films are enigmas rather than allegories. One of the things that I'm constantly warning my students about is, don't go looking for the symbols in films. This is not a symbol hunt. And I think what makes a horror film so interesting is that for such a long time, they were considered, and many people still do consider them this, just sort of the most disreputable of all of the genres. And this actually allowed for all kinds of subversive impulses to be expressed, including political ones. That doesn't mean, though, that they're political tracks. And so, like, you take a film like the 1992 Candyman, the original Candyman, that actually is fascinating, historical, progressive, also problematic, also doesn't always make sense. And so there's this kind of cats in a bag sense of a film where, there's a lot of different ideas that are kind of fighting with each other. I think that does have a politics to it, but I definitely agree with Doug that it's not laid out for us. Like it's not, they're never campaign commercials.
So one thing you said, Scott, that we've been talking a lot about film here, relates to an additional question that an audience member offered, which is about the medium of horror. So let's see here. One attendee says, I'm curious to learn more about how the panelists interpret religion, religious and horror imaginations changing depending on the medium of its presentation, such as the common positioning of book versus movie. So this person writes, as a book, I found Stephen King's It far more terrifying and resonating more with religious themes than like Otto's Numinous. Yet Jordan Peele, openly showcasing the UFO in his film Nope, achieves a terrifyingly tangible imagination of William James' Unseen Order. So, okay, this idea, how do we think about this relationship between religion and horror and how it plays out differently in different media?
Yeah. One thing that often comes to my mind in relation to that is For many people, their experience of horror is in gaming. And of course, this goes back to like the early history of PC and console games. And one of the things that's striking about that in relation to religion is the degree to which various kinds of games, from classics like Doom to very, very recent things like the new game Scorned, use essentially religious iconography to terrify and to frighten. It's a little bit of a carnival ride experience. So, some might, push back against that being an encounter with religious ideas. But I think one of the fascinating things about gaming, as opposed actually to watching a film or reading, is that you're really asked to become an active participant, often in more complex games with more complex narratives, to make moral choices, often in an environment where there are various kinds of beings that are gods, demons, and then something in between. And so I think as that's something that I'm sure that many people are exploring right now, is sort of gaming as a new medium for these questions.
I'm really glad you brought up gaming, because the reason I bought an Xbox over a PS3 was for Halo. And if you look at the Halo universe, it is an explicitly religious universe in which the human characters in this are essentially fighting a religiously motivated war caused by aliens who are engaged in a crusade.
Mm-hmm. It's a holy war. Yes,
it's a
absolutely.
holy war. It's an explicitly religious. The same is true for Warhammer 40K. That's an explicitly religious backdrop to the games, the figurines, the we all painted badly, and now hundreds of novels. Yeah. And I think that's, Scott, you and I and Erica, we've just kind of scratched the surface in our work about what's out there.
Absolutely.
Erica, any thoughts on the medium?
Oh yeah, I haven't read it, but when it was the first miniseries in the 80s, it was getting scary, and then it got really stupid with giant spiders, and lots of times Stephen King stories don't really transfer well to being visualized. Am I right? And a lot of horror movies are just really bad because it's hard to visualize. What you can actually imagine can never match what you can see on the screen, I think, because I think our imaginations are much more terrifying than what could be, used as special effects even. But yeah, I think I ought to read it. It might be scarier than that series. And even the new versions, the new movies, they're like not very scary, I don't think. So with a lot of Stephen King stuff, it's really hard to, I think, transfer it to something visual that would terrify you.
When I was writing America's Dark Theologian, I asked everybody, which is about the religious imagination of Stephen King. I asked everybody I talked to, so if you read Stephen King, what's the scariest Stephen King book you read? Hands down, it was it. Huh. It wasn't even a horse race.
And ask them, did you see the miniseries in the 80s?
Yeah, and I had the same giant spider reaction that you did. Now, Alex Skarsgård as Pennywise in the new one is terrifying, and it was filmed about 10 miles from where I live. Factoid.
So we have just a few minutes left. I would like to give our panelists a chance to offer some closing thoughts or reflections if there's something you want to share that you haven't shared already. And for those in the audience who might be fairly new to thinking about religion and horror, if you were to recommend one television show, book, or film to enjoy this October season, what would you recommend as a great example of how religion and horror intersect? Okay, I know you've seen so many great things.
I know it's hard to pick one, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah.
I'll just start. One of the things this goes back to something that Erica just said, that there are so many bad horror movies out there, and Lord knows, right? There was a French surrealist film critic in the 60s named Adu Kiru. And I take as one of my little touchstones that I work from this quote from his book on surrealist cinema, when he says, we have to learn to look at bad films because they are so often sublime. And what he means by that is, rather than simply dismissing them because they don't present the patina of a blockbuster or the patina of a good film, we have to be willing to at least invest a little bit more in them to see if there is something that can be said, which is why I read about movies nobody's ever heard of. But in terms of one thing that I would encourage people, and again, this is picking up on something Erica said, if you've never read the manga of the Japanese mangaka Junji Ito, Junji Ito, you totally should, because it not only has religion in it, not everywhere, but it has just the most terrifying body horror in it. It's wonderful. And if you want to read the one book in my life I was not able to finish before I went to sleep, Shirley Jackson's The Haunting of Hill House. I had to stop reading it because I was afraid I was not going to be able to go to sleep.
The movie, I saw it when I was about 6, and it was terrifying. The banging on the door you don't know what's behind there, right? And that's even more scary than something you could see. So the 1960s version, the film version, terrifying.
Some people are going to be really mad at me if they go and do this, but that's okay. I'm going to recommend I believe 2021 film Saint Maude.
Oh yeah.
This is the intersection of many of the things we've been talking about, from body horror to Erica, your comments about sort of Catholic shame culture, and the contemplation of death that Doug speaks and writes so well of. So go see Saint Maude, but don't send me angry emails after you've watched it. I'll just go ahead and I don't give trigger warnings, but I will tell you it's a lot.
Yeah.
I don't have any recommendations. I would recommend Evil for those of you who want to be able to approach a text in different ways. It's comedic, it's scary, it's critical in terms of religion. It criticizes religion, and yet it also kind of reaffirms what Doug was saying, that religion isn't all good, but it still reaffirms the power of religious belief and religious power. So Evil on Paramount Plus. They're very easy to watch. It's very bingeable. But I would also encourage audience members to check out quote foreign horror. Korean horror is really good. The Wailing will leave you with a lot of questions, and that's really good when something leaves you with a lot of questions and opens you up to other ways of thinking. So Netflix does offer a lot of really nice selections from Eastern philosophy, and The Wailing is pretty good, I would say. Also Train to Busan, if you haven't seen that, it's really, really good. And it also talks about class as well. So Train to Busan, 2 thumbs up.
Well, thank you, everyone. Oh, Doug.
All I was going to say is that if you're going to watch Evil, Andrea Martin as the Exorcist nun is worth the price of admission to watch Evil.
Well, Well, thank you, everyone. We're at the top of the hour now. I enjoyed this conversation tremendously, and I hope all of you did too. Thank you, Doug, Erica, and Scott. This was a delight.
Thank you.
Please click on the link provided in the chat, which has a short survey. Join us next month, third Thursday at 3 p.m. For our next Religion and episode. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us today.
Thanks so much. Nice to meet you, Erica. Nice to see you, Scott. Thank you so much for having me, Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. Happy Halloween.